Welcome to Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm Don Felker. Welcome. Okay, take it from here, Kaushik.
Hey folks, this is Kaushik. Don's probably halfway across the country somewhere in an RV at this point, so unfortunately he won't be joining me in the discussion today. But we have an amazing guest here who I have the pleasure of chatting with again today. Welcome to the show, Amanda.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Amanda, can you tell us a little about yourself, how you got started in general with programming and how your journey as an Android developer started?
Sure, absolutely. I am the lead Android developer here at Venmo. I started actually my Android career, if you will. You can call it that here at Venmo as well. I actually joined Venmo to help them with Facebook marketing, but it was around the time of the PayPal acquisition and marketing was just kind of not a top priority for us at the time, but Android development was. So I, with the help of some incredible mentors and very kind individuals, learned both Java and Android. And that was a little over a year ago now, and I've basically been doing it ever since.
Wow, that is amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty nuts.
Yeah, I mean, 1 year is like not a long time to learn both.
Yeah, I think when you're learning programming languages in today's age, there's so many boot camps and online resources, so there's definitely too much information out there. And I think my best advice for people, which I realize not everyone has the ability to do, but when you're learning in a professional setting, it makes it a lot easier because there are just high standards and you're not you have practical use for everything that you're learning. And so things like GitHub are just so much easier to learn in a professional setting where it was designed to be used. You know, there are actually other people contributing to a repository. So you understand why you can't, force push things and you learn very quickly.
Completely on something and then push it up to
exactly.
Master. No problems there.
Yeah. So when the stakes are higher, which they tend to be, at a company, it just makes learning that much easier, I think.
Definitely. You make an amazing point there. When you use Git in terms like in a company setting, when you actually have to use it with other people, that's where it really shines and you realize like some of like the nuances of what you should or shouldn't be doing with Git.
Yeah. And I think even like at a code level too, right? Like it's not these like little school projects where no one's ever going to touch them again. So if you want to make it a little like, kind of rough around the edges, when you work for a company and you're contributing to an app like Venmo, which is used by so many people, you don't really have that luxury. So you really have to, everything you do has to be at the standards of, the brand. And it can't just be this like homework assignment that you stay up late doing.
True. I have two follow-up questions with that. I'm going to get to the Venmo bit just in a sec. But before that, with respect to Git, do you do anything special like with respect to using Git at Venmo? Like, I mean, do you use like feature branches? Are there any specific like sort of tips that you have found?
I think it's all I think it's team specific here at Venmo. Okay. I think that every team has their own repository and their own readmes with their own kind of instructional contributing guides and style guides. But we just, as a company, use GitHub Enterprise, and it's really up to the team to decide if there are any kind of funky little things you want to add. So for Android, for example, we have Git attributes that automatically like performs merge unions. So on every pull request, we update the changelog file. And that gets really annoying if you're adding something and then you're rebasing master because there are always merge conflicts with this just markdown file. And it's so silly and you know what the changes are and you just want to say, give me whatever's upstream and then add mine on top of it. So we've added a little kind of law around that so we don't have to do it every single time.
Oh, nice. Yeah. And Git also has these things called like Git hooks, right? Where it sort of like helps with these kind of things where like,
the Git Slack integrations are pretty cool too. So you can hook it up such that, for Android, we have a channel so you can get notifications on builds or pull requests. So if Slack is your preferred kind of medium of communication with the team, they make it really easy.
Okay. The other question I had was like, you mentioned some of like the ways that like get in touch with a mentor, have this accelerated learning pace because 1 year is amazing. So were there any specific resources that you would like to recommend, like any specific courses or like books or something that you feel?
Yeah. So my journey was kind of special in that it was both Java and Android. So on the Java side of things, I actually started with Java for Dummies. I find that the For Dummies series are actually not for dummies, and that they're really well-written books by really formative experts in the field.
Right.
That was really useful. After that, Joshua Bloch's Effective Java is an absolute must-read. Both of my mentors swear by it. It's like our Java Bible, and it's wonderful. I think there are 27 just hard and true rules about Java that are really good. And then for Android, I did the Big Nerd Ranch Android book, and they're actually coming out with an updated version this October, I believe.
Yeah, I think I saw a pre-release or something, right?
Because the version that I use actually was written for Eclipse, and the new version uses Android Studio. But to be honest, Eclipse and Android Studio were so similar that it was really easy to follow along. A lot of the menus and settings and everything were kind of in the same place. But on top of that, and the thing that I think really makes a difference, and actually something I found that is more difficult to find in today's kind of landscape, are computer science classes. And if you are new to engineering, it's not just about programming and it's not just about language and syntax. There's some real science and math behind a lot of this. And I actually took this professor at Harvard, David Malan, puts all of his classes up on YouTube.
Oh, yep.
And so I took quotation fingers Intro to Computer Science with him and a couple of other higher level CS courses via my Apple TV and YouTube.
Perfect. That makes sense. Whenever I want to brush some concepts in computer science, I did the ones from Berkeley, like the California Berkeley courses.
Yeah.
A bunch of them. Those were...
Yeah, MIT has a bunch of good ones as well.
Oh, yeah. MIT has one as well. So we'll add a link to all of those in the show notes. If people want to go and get their computer science fundamentals straightened out, there's plenty of watching material there. Okay, so Venmo is a pretty cool place to work for. I definitely want to talk a little more about that towards the end. But recently, I think I saw a libdub video up somewhere?
Yes.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah. So actually last week was our hack week. So once a year during the summer, because that's when we have the most interns.
Okay.
We have a hack week, which is a fun opportunity for the company, because it allows everyone, both engineering, business operations, to kind of collaborate on anything that you want. So there are awards at the end of the week, and those are voted and based on, value to Venmo, how much they align with our company goal, but that doesn't mean that you can't work on something totally unrelated that you just are really interested in. So last summer, we had interns work, we had a street light. I don't even know where we got the street light, but they hooked it up to our servers. So anytime the servers were up and, returning 200s, it was a green light. And if there were errors or something went wrong, it was a yellow or a red light.
Wow. So this was like an actual real traffic light inside your office?
Yeah.
That sounds amazing.
It was really, it's a lot of fun things like that. This year, we had someone, we have showers in the office, and two of our engineers on the data team built actually a piece of hardware that goes in the locks in the shower, and it hooks up to a Slack bot, and you can go onto the Slack channel. It's like showers. And you can see, you can ask the Slack bot if the showers are locked, which means that someone's probably in there. So you know that they're busy.
Wow,
So it's just a fun opportunity to really learn something new. Venmo is a really fantastic place for learning. Everyone here, I don't know if it's written down anywhere as one of our core values, but definitely from a cultural perspective, it is absolutely something everyone values really highly. So it was a fun week.
That is
and the
wicked.
lift-up video, to get back to that, was someone's a Hack Week project.
Nice. Okay. So we'll add links to those in the show notes. All right. So the last time I talked to you, this was at I.O. You said you haven't worked on iOS at all.
Yeah.
I believe things have changed.
Yes,
you have
they
turned
have.
to the dark side, haven't you?
I have.
Oh my God.
I can't believe I'm admitting this on an Android podcast, but I have.
Have you lost you, Amanda?
No, not at all. It's actually interesting. I can't decide if iOS engineers would enjoy coming to Android more, or if Android engineers would enjoy going to iOS more. The biggest fundamental difference to me so far is the loss of XML layouts.
Oh boy, yeah.
Layouts in iOS all happen programmatically.
Tell me more. Because I've been like, this is like a common rant that I have because in my company as well, when I chat with some of the iOS engineers, sometimes I feel terrible because of how easy it is for them to do some things. And sometimes I feel like, wow, that is like so much more easier to do with Android. So tell me more. And just to be clear, like, with iOS specifically, you were working with Swift, or was it also like just Objective-C?
All Swift.
Okay.
So actually, the reason I hadn't gotten into iOS for the longest time was because of Objective-C. It's a really difficult, it's a really difficult switch to go from Java to Objective-C. I think C-based languages they're just drunk. I mean, they're so silly to me, and that is definitely coming from an Android person. I mean, a Java person. But I think Swift is a lot more syntactically similar to Java, so it's so much easier to learn. It's readable, first of all. A lot of little things like to call an instance method in Java, you add a dot and you call the method. So it would be like button dot set color. That makes sense to me. In Swift, it's the same thing. Whereas in Objective-C, you put the button and the method in a bracket and you separate it by a space and it's like backwards. So Swift has made it really easy for me to collaborate with the iOS team, to work with them, literally read and write their code.
So you mentioned, so it's definitely more readable. Were there any other aspects to Swift that you thought you liked?
I think Swift is a really cool next language if you are familiar with Java and RxJava, because they definitely take a lot of the and retro lambdas. So it's a very similar stylistic language to like reactive Java with retro lambdas. Enums are a really big thing in Swift now that Objective-C never really had. So everyone on the iOS team here is just like obsessed with enums right now, which kind of is silly to me because we've always had those.
True. But with the Android world, there's always been this thing, right? Should I use enums or should I not use enums? That just keeps coming up. It's almost like dogma at some point, right?
Yeah.
Everyone's like, use enums. No, don't use enums.
Yeah. But I think the best thing about Swift, which Java would really benefit from, are optionals.
I have heard the options are pretty good.
It basically prevents you from ever throwing the equivalent of a null pointer exception, because it forces you, when you declare an object, to say, is it an optional? Is it nullable? And if it is, you have to say what to do if it's null.
Right.
Whereas in Java, you have to know ahead of time that it's possible for it to be null and then do a check. And then if it isn't null or it is null, do something, but you're not forced into that situation.
Right.
So I think from like an app stability perspective, it means that your errors and your crashes will just never be from nulls, which is really like such a wild dream for me.
And it's pretty common too, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because every time you sort of like you're knee deep, you're coding, you want to just like get something out of your head out there, and you forget these small sort of like weird like quirks. To the language, and then boom. The next thing you know, you have an NP in your hand.
Exactly.
Okay, nice. So, have you worked with Kotlin before? Because like this is also something that I've heard JetBrains' Kotlin has the optionals.
I've looked at Kotlin a little bit. Kotlin was cool because it just compiles so much faster and it's so much more lightweight. And the Android build time is just so painful.
Oh boy.
I actually do the New York Times crossword puzzle every day during build times, in 30 to 47 second intervals.
Okay.
But I've only really read the Kotlin docs. I haven't really written anything in Kotlin.
Yeah, me too. I have sort of like experimented, did the usual like hello world kind of things.
Right.
But I haven't gotten too deep into it. I've not yet like made the switch to sort of like, moving to a different language completely in my production applications. A quick follow-up to also the thing you mentioned. You said retro lambda. You guys use retro lambda and RxJava a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Is this also in the production application? Is this also like in Venmo? Does Venmo actually use retro lambda in your production applications?
We do.
Amazing. How has that been? I mean, because I know a common question because I haven't made the jump yet to using retro lambda either.
Really?
No, I it's just in my production applications, I haven't pulled the trigger just yet because I've heard there are like some weird cases. Obviously, those are edge cases and like those aren't like big things. I remember like Dan was on our show and like he mentioned This is Dan Liu. So
Dan Liu, yeah.
He mentioned that they use retro lambda as well in Trello.
Mm-hmm.
So and he said like there's like one weird case which usually you don't hit upon, but for some reason I've just like not pulled the trigger yet. So I'm trying to collect like information from everyone. Hey, do you use it? So this is my chance. Have you run into any problems with retro lambda as such?
The only issues that come to mind are around testing, and depending what kind of testing framework or testing service you use. Some retro lambdas are not compatible with older versions of Java, and so like bytecode doesn't translate well. So you'll get into some testing bugs, but we don't. We have a workaround for that here. So it really isn't an issue. And for me, retro lambdas make the code actually a lot simpler to read. Mm-hmm. I think the anonymous overriding method sometimes is a little bit too much information. And it just makes the classes look a lot sleeker, which from a compiler perspective makes zero difference. But I think just visually, someone coming into the code base, it makes it a lot easier.
Absolutely. This is also something that's interesting to talk about because the IntelliJ IDE has like this auto-folding mechanism. So it sort of like makes it a little better, but it's just not the same. It's not the same as having like true lambdas.
Yeah.
And another difference that not many people realize, which I find is also a primary advantage with like using retro lambda or even lambdas, Java 8's lambdas, is with anonymous inner classes. Like one of the biggest problems is it automatically has a reference to your enclosing parent. So if you use like an anonymous inner class in your activity or your fragment, in all likelihood you have a reference to the activity or the fragment. Mm-hmm. But in the cases of lambdas and also retro lambdas, like if you don't explicitly use a variable or something that, if you don't explicitly need the reference of the enclosing parent, in the actual compiled bytecode, it doesn't maintain a reference.
Oh, so wow.
That is something that's
really neat.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So there's actually an advantage to using lambdas and retro lambdas. So, okay, I got to get on it and get my team to sort of make this shift. And
absolutely,
I shall report back with my problems or my tales of glory. One thing that I've heard that iOS has, previously at least, that they did better before was animations.
Yeah.
And this is basically sort of our main topic for the day. Mm-hmm. 25 minutes in. Good job, Kaushik. This is what happens if Don's not
right
on a show. We go crazy. But in any case, animations I've heard for like a long time were way more easier to do with iOS. Now the thing is, I also sort of like hopped onto the Android wagon a tad bit later. So when I learned about animations, it didn't seem as difficult as I thought it would be. But this is also because there was like one huge sea of change that came in. Do you like, to start off, do you think is that statement true? Like, do you think animations are just easier to deal with iOS than it is on Android?
I haven't truthfully done a lot of animations on iOS, but I think I do in my working with my colleagues, the things that they're able to do at the speed they're able to do them leads me to believe the answer to that is yes.
Okay.
I think in general the way that iOS platform is built is it's very UI focused. That is, that's Apple at its core, right?
Right.
And I think with Android, the SDK is a lot more mathematically true, right? So in Android, instead of saying like, if you wanted to get scroll direction, you actually just get like zero, like negative or positive numbers indicating up or down, which like you could do anything you want with those mathematical truths, whereas iOS will be like, it's moving up, it's moving down.
Oh, yeah.
So when you extrapolate that out to animations, I think that they definitely make it a lot easier to achieve visually kind of cool, quirky things.
As is the case with most things with Google, like it's built primarily for engineers, which is, it's definitely a good thing for most engineers.
And I think with permissions too, actually, I just had a conversation with a colleague last week about how Apple really, the way their permissions is structured is such that it really benefits the users more than they care more about the users than they do the engineers, and Google cares more about the engineers than we do about the users.
Right. Okay, so what were some of the first animations that you built with Android?
So one of my first projects at Venmo, and something that we're still working on is converting a lot of our web views in the app to native. To native screens. And so I worked on the incoming requests screen. So if someone charges you money or if someone wants to be your friend, all those sort of notifications now live on one native page. And for confirming a payment, when you accept a payment, we have an animation where under the request, there are two buttons, one for pay, one for decline. But when you tap pay, actually, the button animates all the way to fill out the whole space where the other button previously existed and kind of animates down, showing you where the money is going to come from. If it's your Venmo balance, it says like what your balance is. If it's a credit card, it says what your credit card number is. And the button changes colors, and then you hit confirm payment. Because we're dealing with money, you got to give people all the information.
Right.
So that was my first kind of big animation. And the thing about that, which was kind of tricky, was these are a list of requests. So you're not just animating one object, you're animating like a row, an item in a list.
Ah, interesting.
And list view animations are no fun on Android.
I know. So my very first animation was also like for a list view. I mean, granted, it wasn't as complicated as that one. I remember because I've historically been a web developer, so I jumped onto Android right away. So it was a very big moment for me when I had to like write my first animation, because it's the first time that I actually like got to use like something that was complicated enough to look decent to a user. If I remember right, the way I did it was like inside the adapter, like in my get view call. As each like view came in, I was like, oh, just put a delay. So like as the items sort of like showed up on the list, I sort of added this animation so it would slide up from the bottom and come up. And I was so proud of that animation. I went around showing it to all my colleagues, and the iOS folks were like, is that not a checkbox for us? Like, I think that's like a checkbox and you'd get that for free. So animations are not too bad to deal with. It was like a lot of fun. To begin, like, what were some of the resources that you used to learn animations?
So actually, there is a GitHub. I think it's Snowdream GitHub, and they have just like a massive list of Android libraries that are like all on GitHub. So they're all open source Android libraries. And that is almost always the first place I go when I'm trying to learn anything on Android. They have like, stuff for widgets, stuff for animations, stuff for like event bus, image loading, icons, like anything.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's really amazing. So that's a good place to start. That's where I started. And then old Google I.O. talks, actually. Animations is always a topic. It's always in some session. So if you want to go on YouTube and kind of go down the I.O. rabbit hole, there's some really good talks there. Roman Guy actually gave a talk, I think in 2013 about list view animation specifically, and that was really useful. And all of that's open source, and you can see his code. So that was those were both my kind of big resources.
Nice. I've never heard. Did you say it was Snowdream?
Yeah, snowdream.github.io.
Interesting. I've never heard of that. That's amazing.
Yeah.
I'll add a link.
It's the longest list you've ever seen of that. I didn't even know there were this many people doing Android.
That is cool. It's always fun to have good samples out there. So the way I've primarily learned most of the way animations are done is like Google has these dev bytes.
Right.
So Chet Haase usually has like a dev byte explaining how like something works, and it's pretty good. So what I'll do is I'll add a link to the YouTube playlist of dev bytes. People have to like scroll all the way to the bottom, because that's where like some of the first few dev bytes, I think the first 6 or 8 or 10 of them were all on animations, and those were just like amazing. They're very interesting. Okay, so let's maybe dive in to a little more detail with respect to animations. There's this whole concept of animations, and then there's this whole like this other section on transitions, right?
Yeah.
So like there's like transitions, the newer transitions that came about in 4.4 KitKat.
Yeah.
And there's also like activity animations and fragment animations.
Yes.
But really what they are like transitions. They are not necessarily animations. This is something also Google is flawless at, which is basically naming things completely in the most confusing way.
Yes, that is.
I mean, it's built for engineers, and sometimes I feel like engineers maybe don't care about naming as much, but naming is so important. I mean,
it's my old colleague and I used to joke that what we do for a living is just name methods. There's this weird concept that as an engineer you have to be good at numbers, but really you have to be good at naming methods.
That's why they pay our salaries. It's just to pick good names.
Exactly.
So we're not necessarily going to dive into transitions and activity animations and fragment animations, maybe in another episode. But what we want to talk about is the crux of animations, right?
Yeah.
So when I started with animations, I was confused as hell. And the reason, it was easy to just look at an example or a sample, pull out some code out of there and just dump the code and then have an animation work and be happy about it. But when I wanted to sort of understand the two crux of how this thing is even structured, because there are animations, there are animators, there's animator sets, there's animation set, there's view property animator, there's view animator, there are a bunch of things. And for a long time, I just couldn't wrap my head around it because I was like, oh, that says animation, or it has the word the word animation in its name. So I should probably try using that.
Yep.
And you can quickly enter this sort of maze of confusion if you don't get your naming right. So this is one thing that I want to maybe tell our listeners, because I found it really helpful. So there's this blog post by Chet. This was during the time of Honeycomb, right? So Honeycomb in Android had this massive transition, because I think that was the point where they said hey, we really need to get the whole animation framework sort of a rehaul, right? So they literally rethought the whole way you actually do animations in Honeycomb.
Yeah.
There's this whole thing called view animations. So view animations, as I understand, is in the pre-Honeycomb days, right? So essentially, like you said, they thought about adding animations, but animations was thought about specifically only with respect to views, which is why some of the older animation classes that I've noticed, and again, Chet goes into a lot of detail in this blog post, and I definitely suggest everyone just take a read, even if you've never read before, because it establishes this sort of line in the sand that says okay, pre-Honeycomb, this is how things work. And the way they were was essentially most of the animations and the classes that you have were specifically in the view animation package. So if you look at an animation class or a helper that you're using, and if it happens to be in the Android.view.animation package, then you know basically that's the pre-Honeycomb days.
Right.
But Animator, Object Animator, ValueAnimator, these are post-Honeycomb days. So
and they're all in the widget. Kind of package now.
Right. So they don't fall under the view.animation package. So the drawback with the view animations specifically before Honeycomb was that you could only animate views, nothing else. So if you wanted to change a drawable position or a background color, the translucency, if you want to animate those things, those were very hard to do. There was a limited set of options that you could animate.
Yeah.
So those things were a little tricky. And as you rightly pointed out, that's why they started out. Again, Google is amazing for engineers. So there's okay, we're going to think about this thing called Animator, right? And we have ValueAnimator. So they didn't want to restrict it to just view. That's why this whole property animation came in. So that's why they introduced property animations. And they wanted to sort of rethink the way you do animations in general. They didn't want to limit it just to views. So it's and it's also not limited just to properties on an object. They he mentions it in a much more succinct manner. He says they don't necessarily want to concentrate just on the visual animation aspect. So they want you to animate values, right?
Yeah.
Over time, and these values are basically then assigned to target objects, and that's where the whole animator, value animator, and the object animator come in.
Yeah.
So the core class is Animator, I believe, right? That's basically the super class of everything to begin in. And the next sort of subclass is a value animator.
Yes.
And again, I want to point out, this is I believe there's something called a view animator as well, which is very, very different from value animator.
Yes.
If you have a frame layout, there's this base class that does animations when you want to switch views, and that's view animator.
Right. So, view animator is really more of a transition animator than it is in what we would think of as widgets. It's really meant between switching frame layouts specifically. You wouldn't use it to animate a text view.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense now. So it's like a completely different realm as ValueAnimator.
Yeah, it's also that ValueAnimator is in the widget package versus Value and Object Animator are both in the animation package.
Ah, perfect. Sometimes if you just look at the package name, it makes it so much more clear. I was like, oh, okay, this is like going to be dealt with just like on the widget side or versus the animation side. So that's like a huge, like this was like a sort of like a revelation to me. I'm like, oh, so that's where the difference lies. ValueAnimator, again, is like the main workhorse. So basically it does like all like the calculations. It has an internal timing loop, and that's where like all the crux of how like the values are moved around is the logic for all of that is inside the ValueAnimator. Right. And the way it's done is like, okay, you have this thing that calculates all the values. It does like all the calculations to calculate the correct value for each of the animation points. But then, and again, it's like the tree falling analogy, right? So if you calculate the animations and do all of this, it doesn't really make sense unless you sort of like apply it to a specific object that you want animated upon, like with these values, right? And that's where the object animator comes in. Yes. So it's like animator is like the superclass. You proceed to ValueAnimator, which does just like the animations, and then you have object animator, which takes in those values and applies it specifically to an object. And I guess almost 90% of the cases you would want to use like an object animator, right? Is that true, or other? Oh, okay. So there is like, we'll go into like, I guess, view property animation. Right. So that's way more easier. But okay, for a template, if you didn't have the view property animator, like an object animator is essentially what you would use.
An object animator is really gonna, the way that I like to think about it is, an object animator is going to change anything that you would have written initially in XML. So it's going to be alpha, background color, maybe like the Y translation. So things like that kind of fall under object animator to me. Whereas ValueAnimator are the things that are harder to set that you might not have necessarily set in XML. So like if you wanted to set the height of something, I realize that you can set that in XML, but if you wanted to like actually animate the height and it was originally set to just kind of wrap content, that's where you would use a ValueAnimator.
Okay, interesting. I've never used like the animator class directly. I don't think you typically would need to use the animator, but have you used the ValueAnimator directly by any chance?
I actually have used both the animator and the ValueAnimator.
Oh, wow. Okay, tell me more.
So I use the ValueAnimator for row heights. So in what I was saying earlier, the animation that I worked on was for list view. When we animate open, when you tap the button and it slides over and then expands, you actually need to expand the height of the cell itself. Otherwise, it will kind of, it'll be hidden under the background. And this is actually an interesting kind of tidbit. If you run into list view animations, issues with like changing the height of your cell, because list view tries to be very smart and it helps you recycle your views.
Right.
So for example, if you were to change the background of a list cell and then you scrolled, every 8th item or whatever the number is going to have that red background.
Right.
So Roman Guy has a blog post about how you kind of get around that. And he basically tells you to force in the adapter getView method, force it to call it again. Which is helpful if the thing that you're overriding, you like set the initial state of in XML. So if you set the initial background color to be white, then when you call getView, it'll be set back. But if you're like most of us, and the height is something you've animated in XML, it doesn't have a like statically defined height. It has like a height, like it's to wrap content. It doesn't have a height. So calling getView again doesn't actually reset the size.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So how would you handle that then?
You actually, what I did, which I don't know if it's better because you're kind of circumventing the logic that ListView would like to be doing, right? It's trying to recycle for you.
Right.
But kind of the sneaky way around it is, and it seems kind of silly, but at the end of the height animation, I either want to return it to its original state, but most likely what happens is people confirm the payment. So actually, I want the cell to just animate entirely away. And so if you just delete the item from the adapter or from the list, it takes care of deleting that view for you. and it destroys the view. So if you, when it goes to recycle, it's not there anymore. That index has been removed.
Okay. So we're basically, it's sort of like a hack that uses like another property of the way the recycling works.
Exactly. So not ideal, but
that's clever. That is clever.
Definitely an option.
Okay. So you use the ValueAnimator specifically for like sort of like handling the heights is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Have you used any sort of like custom sort of animations as such? Like, have you built like a custom animator or anything along those lines?
Yeah. So, I, on the Android Compose page, if we're going to get specific, we have, you can either pay someone or you can request money from them. We had to add, a feature to confirm that after you say send money, that you actually mean to send the money. So it's kind of this secondary step.
Okay.
What we wanted to do was have that animation be really smooth. So if I hit confirm, you want that whole button to slide to fill up the whole view. And the way that you would build this as two buttons is a linear layout with weights. And I actually use a custom ValueAnimator to animate the weight of whichever one of the buttons I'd like to show.
Interesting. So is weight like a property directly that you can just like access or no?
It is. If you, in linear layout, you can get, just layout parameters, and weight is a value on linear layouts. And you can then ValueAnimator, the weight is just a float, and you can set the weight to the animated value that you want.
Oh, interesting. This makes a lot of sense. And the advantage, I guess, with using weights, obviously, like for that specific animation that we're talking about, if you want a button, and this is like such a common thing, right? If you want two buttons to have like an equal width and you want to like account for screen sizes, and like, very natural way to do it is with like a linear layout, right?
Yeah.
And have like two of those buttons.
Yeah. And you can kind of, that way you don't have to worry about where it is, what the width of the phone is. You also can change the duration. You can add an interpolator to go faster, slower, accelerate, decelerate, and it kind of abstracts all of that away from you.
Right. I mean, at that point, you have like essentially just cracked it open, right? So like you have a bunch of things that you can do. That makes a lot of sense. So one thing I found interesting is this whole like values and properties, right? So maybe we should talk about Object Animator a little more, and I guess it probably might make sense. The way I typically use like Object Animator, so a sample call would be Object Animator of float, and in the parameters you would pass in first the object, because again, the primary objective of the Object Animator is to sort of target a single object, right?
Yep.
So you supply as the first parameter the object, and this is where it gets interesting, right? The second parameter that you pass in is essentially this property of the object that we talk about, right?
It's the property name.
Property name. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's why you would pass in things like alpha or like.
Right. And that's why to me it matches up so nicely with anything you would define in XML, because it's exactly, if you're writing it in XML and Android : background color, Android : alpha, any of those property names are what you're passing through in an Object Animator method.
Yeah. And this is something that like I picked up recently, because initially, the way they did that was, I think it was the API 14, where you couldn't essentially, I don't recall exactly which API level it was, but like you said, you literally pass in like the property name, right? So like alpha. So you would pass a string called alpha. Obviously, it uses reflection in the background, because that's the only way it would sort of like convert that to like a property and add like a set or get method on top of that property, right? I believe then they brought in a more sort of like canonical way to do it. And so like on the view class, like there's like a static constant where you can specify like view.alpha, like the property names were given like constants. And the next two or one or possibly two parameters that you would pass in are the values that you want animated on for that property specifically, right? So that's like how the Object Animator call is made. One thing that I found interesting is with respect to the properties, you can, because if you went the reflection route, and this is not something that like they removed away from you, you can, I mean, this is like the core way that it works. If you have a property, like if you had any random property, assuming you had like this property that didn't exist natively with the Android SDK, you could have like maybe a custom view and possibly have your own property. The hidden assumption about like these properties is that they should have getter and setter functions on the view. if you actually had the getter setter functions, you could actually pass in just the property name, and the animations would work. And it seems almost magical, but obviously that's how like the reflection would work, right? And it's just this contract depending on how the animations are worked on by the system. So if you have like a getter setter function with the specific property and you give the property that name, you could go all in, add your own like super custom property and then have that animated.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you had, if you created a custom view and then, you know, in like an attributes XML file named all the custom things for it, you could absolutely create kind of a static property object, which would take in the view itself and then whatever the value was. So if it was like a string or if it was an integer, depending on what it was that you were doing, just a get for the value. So if that's again a string or a float or whatever, and then a static void set method.
Since we're touching upon the properties, right? This is there's this concept called a type evaluator. So again, like these names are not very friendly. Like it's hard to sort of like understand what they mean at the face of it. But like if you like dive in and try to learn one of these terms one by each day, then it makes sense. So these properties, you mentioned that gravity is actually like an integer or like a float value, right? So you have float values, you have integer values. Natively, like we mentioned, this whole timing loop that happens with the ValueAnimator, the Android system essentially needs to understand how the progression of values go, right?
Yes.
And that is essentially what the type evaluator object does.
Yes.
Usually you don't have to deal with it because most properties are either like a float or an int or a point. And natively the system has float evaluators, point evaluators, and int evaluators, which are basically implementations of this type evaluator object. There's also another one I remember for color specifically, which
is RGB evaluator.
Exactly, ARGB evaluator. So these are evaluator objects that help the system understand how you should move between different values.
Yeah.
So you could even go crazy and have like this new system that you want to build. And then if you provide an evaluator to the animator object and let it know how it should be like moving between values, then you could do that as well, right? So you can build your own super fancy animation system with this thing. They want to expose as much as possible so that you can leverage the platform to use like all sort of animations.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of comes back to my point about how Android is really A, designed for engineers, and B, is designed to be just mathematically true. And you can use these things to create UI elements and UI animations. But at its core, what they are just mathematical functions, right? A type evaluator is literally some like linear interpolator that is telling you how to get from X to Z.
Right.
I just pulled up the type evaluator source code, and I love the Android SDK source code. This is an actual quote. The calculation is a simple parametric calculation. Result equals XO plus T times X1 minus XO.
Yeah,
so it's so simple.
It's obvious, right? I mean, again, you should know this. Like, wake me up in the morning, the first thing I'll start spewing out is stuff like this, right?
Exactly.
Speaking about like math and evaluation, so this is something that always threw me off for a very long time. With X and Y in the Android system, if I give it a positive X, which direction does it go? Does it go to the left? Does it go to the right?
It's because... and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think it's because the zero, like the where the two axes meet, is like the upper right-hand corner of the screen.
So it's actually the upper left corner.
Oh, upper left, okay.
So this is, again, so confusing. So in coordinate geometry, there are like 4 quadrants. Like if you had the x-axis and the y-axis, the x is the horizontal axis, the y is the vertical one. The point that they meet is the center, which is typically in a coordinate system, that would be 0, 0.
Right. And that would be the center.
That would be the center. So even in coordinate geometry, when the x and the y axis meet, they're given names. Each quadrant is given like name. There's the first quadrant, which is like the upper right. There's the second quadrant, which is the upper left. There's the third quadrant, which is 1, 2, 3, 4.
Bottom left, yeah.
Bottom left. And then there's the fourth quadrant, which is the bottom right.
And they wouldn't pick the first quadrant because then all the numbers would be positive, and that would be too simple.
Yeah, exactly, right? I mean, you can't make life that easy.
Let's go with the fourth.
And that's what they did. They chose the bottom right corner.
What I always get caught up on is sometimes if you're animating something, it's not actually in relation to the screen itself, but it's in relation to its parent view.
Oh, yeah.
So that's a whole other set of numbers that you were not thinking of because you're trying to animate this one child view, and it's not actually like its true position, it's its position in relation to its parent. And this is a tool, I don't know what the like technical term that iOS uses, but iOS has this like view inspector where you can basically like take whatever view you're working on and like rotate it sideways, and you can see all the layers of the view.
Ah, okay. So like I remember Chrome had that thing, right? Like Google, the Chrome browser like had something where you could like do something.
Yeah, and it's like I wish there was a tool, maybe there is, in Android where you could kind of, other than an XML, like seeing the way that I've like nested things, if there was some visual kind of GUI for like where my views are nested and like what their like position is related to their parent.
I know there definitely is one tool. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I'll definitely add a link to that show notes.
Yes.
I also think Facebook's Stetho library, I should check this.
Oh, yeah.
I think Stetho has something like that.
Stetho just really links up to Chrome for like debugging. I mean, I guess it makes sense they'd have some sort of visual debugging as well, but...
I could be confusing it with just like Chrome in general, but if I remember, I know for sure they have like a view inspector. So you could, I mean, they actually like dump out like the XML views. So like, I know they had that. I think that like, that's like the view hierarchy.
Yeah.
I think they also have like a visual thing. I could be totally wrong with this, but like, yeah, but there is something. And like, I'll definitely add a link to the show notes, and maybe in the next episode in our follow-up, we point out. The next interesting tool is like the Animator set, right? What exactly is the Animator set?
The Animator set allows you to play, to define the ordering of animations that you want to play.
Okay.
So if you had, for example, in my like list view animation, I'm animating the button left and I'm animating the height and I'm changing alphas and colors. You can basically say, play this with this, before this, after that. And then you just call play on the whole thing. Ah,
interesting. So, so the obvious question is like, well, why do I have to have a new object for this, right? Is it just like syntactic sugar? I could just have an object animated, like the first object animated, the second one, and just like execute them one after the other, right? Why wouldn't that work? The reason that wouldn't, well, I mean, that just gives you one aspect, right? If you had everything execute one after the other, then that's straightforward. But what Animator set allows you is to essentially choreograph this whole animation. So you could have like, oh, do this, but as this happens, do this. But after both of these are done, do that. It allows you to sort of like really time these in a more convenient manner. I guess what you could do is like you could execute the object animator animations at the exact intervals of time, like with the delays, and then maybe achieve the same thing. You obviously don't have to go through that hassle. Like the Animator set is essentially just meant for that, right? It's to combine a whole bunch of animations. Usually I try to only deal with an Animator set and the object animator, unless obviously you have to like dive in and sort of like crack it open for something custom.
Yeah, and the other cool thing about Animator set is in addition to kind of like the obvious methods that allow you to kind of force these object animators to have dependencies on one another in terms of ordering. You can also, my favorite is reverse.
Oh my, yeah, that is so useful.
You can literally call set.reverse and it just like undoes it.
Oh, that is, yeah. So we should talk about view property animators. One thing I like about the view property animator is it follows this whole Fluent API system, right? And it's really easy to trigger an animation, especially if it's something small, like, okay, just like move it by X. What you can do is like, if you have your view object, you can call animate, like the method animate on it. And boom, suddenly you have like, it returns a view property animator, right? And on top of that, you can just like do like the properties that we talked about. Like you can do like a dot X or dot X by provide the value, then dot Y by provide these values. And you have all of those animations, right? If I had to write the equivalent in, with object animators, usually that tends to be like what I would otherwise do with like one line of code would take me like 5 lines of code, right? 5 or 4 lines of code. So the view property animator, as I understand, has better performance. Like I don't know why, but it's mentioned in some point in the docs that apparently they have slightly better performance. And also, the other obvious advantage is it's super easy, right? I mean, just like you call the animate method on the object and boom, you're ready to go with like animations. There are, however, also disadvantages. I don't think you can reverse very easily with view property animators. With animator sets, you can,
Right.
With view property animators, I don't think there's an easy way to sort of like reverse animations. I could totally be wrong and people would correct me if, I'm wrong. But like my understanding is like that is like a disadvantage.
Yeah.
And like Animator said, you can do sequential animations, but if you want to like group animations and like sort of like play around with those timings, it's a little harder to do that with the view property animator.
Yeah, you lose a little bit of control for sure.
Exactly. So the next primary object that usually when you want to like play around with feel of animations, right, is like the interpolator object.
Mm-hmm.
So can you throw some light on what the interpolator object is? You mentioned it a couple of times before.
Yeah, I mean, it basically allows you to set kind of the acceleration or deceleration of your animation.
Okay, so it's just like, I guess there's like a default animation. Is that how it's different? Like there's like this default speed at which animations run?
Animation, yeah. So they typically run in a linear fashion, I believe. And you can change that ratio though.
And I think this is like a generic concept. It's not specific to just like the Android animation framework. Interpolators are like a generic concept. It's very easy to get either these playful or these most realistic sort of reactions to your animations, right? So some common interpolators are like, there's the bounce one, there's overshoot, accelerate, decelerate, like you mentioned. So these kind of effects that you want to add to your animations, you can do them very easily with interpolators. And it's so simple. All you have to do is the animation object that you have, you just set an interpolator. So object animators have, I guess most other animator objects also have this method. You can just like directly set interpolator on them and provide it an instance of an interpolator, and boom, you're off to the races.
Yep. It's really nice. And the great thing there, again, I'm going to say this 1,000 times, but you can make your own. You can write your own. So again, it's all about like just mathematical truths in Android. So they've definitely done some of the work for you, but because it's all open source and it's exposed kind of where the functions are and how they're kind of going from the 0 to 1 ratio, you can customize it if you want it to be something kind of crazy.
Right. I just can't resist. I have to say this. One of my awesome picks for this episode is actually a blog post. I don't remember who the person is. Let me look at my notes quickly. Okay, so it's Yalantis. So that's basically the name of the website. And they talk about how they built this Guillotine animation. So like a guillotine is like for essentially when someone's getting beheaded in the olden days, you have this sort of giant knife-like thing that like whoop, just like swoops in.
Guillotine, it just comes down and...
Exactly. So somebody built this custom interpolator that follows the similar pattern.
A gravity interpreter.
It's actually like the blog post is really well done. Like they actually, and it allowed me to geek out just a little because they also go into the mathematical equations that they use. They sort of like visualize how they want the animation in terms of a function, and then they split each section out to follow a specific equation. And then this may sound like kind of like crazy, but actually if like one reads the blog post, it's very well done. If you read that, then you're like, oh, I can write an interpolator on my own. It's pretty straightforward. So again, if you want to read Amanda Ninja standards in writing custom everything for animations, you should feel free to like sort of read that blog post.
Yeah, I'll definitely check that out.
So we talked a lot about like the post Honeycomb world. I want to just quickly touch on the pre-Honeycomb animation. So at least like if people run into them, they know that they're dealing with the pre-Honeycomb days or like the post-Honeycomb days. So one is frame animations. I must mention frame animations are pre-Honeycomb days, but they're super useful even today. The way frame animations work is it's super simple. You can achieve extremely complex animations in a very simple way. But the way you do it is you just provided a sequence of like images or like drawables. You can say, okay, at time 0, show this frame. At time 1, show this frame. At time 2, at the second mark, show this frame. So you can like have this super complex, fancy animation. And all you have to do is just provide it a sequence of frames. You say, okay, play these frames at these intervals. And it'll just play the same thing. So many of these new material animations for icons where like an app we constantly recommend is Pocket Cast, right? So the Pocket Cast folk basically have this amazing play pause animation. As you hit the play button and you keep toggling the two options, it transforms from a play into the pause button. I know there was the back and the navigation drawer or the home button. I know that was like a very common most Google applications did that. So if you want to animate images, you could, I guess, do it like in a very purely mathematical form and build the whole thing, but that would just be crazy talk, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it would be extremely difficult to build. So if you want to build these really fancy kind of animations where you're animating images, frame animations are a very nice and convenient way to do this. Unfortunately, the disadvantage is because you're using that many images and drawbles, it's obviously more, it's not as performant as you would like it. But sometimes you can achieve some super complex, fancy looking stuff with frame animations. There's also this thing called the layout animation controller. And I think we mentioned, maybe this was when we were talking offline, I guess. So the layout animation controller is also this like super simple thing. It's pretty old. What it does, most of the layouts that we use, they come with these sort of like preloaded animations. So it's basically like a switch that you can turn on in your layout. Even list views have this. You can basically just say, okay, hey, turn on your animation. So anytime you hide an element or you show an element, it accounts for these things. So it's nice for like the simple stuff. So if you want like a basic set of animations applied across the views, it just like does it for you. But if you want more control, obviously this is not something you'll have to crack it open again.
Yeah. It would be cool to hook up the animations to some of the reactive observables, like on tech, in that case, like on text change.
Interesting.
You could be like listening for text change events, and then you could like throttle 500 milliseconds, so you're not doing it like immediately. You're kind of waiting for users to stop typing, or you could filter it by number, like once they've typed 2 letters or something.
That is an excellent idea. So people listening, reactive animations is what Amanda is looking for.
Yeah.
So someone build it and then let us know, and we'll put it up in the show notes.
And then call me and we'll give you a job at Venmo.
Oh, yeah. I see what you did there. Nice play.
Just slip that one right in.
I know. Very slick there. Okay, so in general, what's your advice towards animation?
There's actually another really useful thing I find is looking at apps that exist and looking at animations that you like and thinking about how you would build them. This is a conversation actually that I have all the time with Kevin Grant, who works at Tumblr. And we always kind of joke about if you got 5 Android developers in a room and you showed them one animation, you'd end up with 27 different ways to animate it.
That is probably true.
So that's always kind of a fun exercise and a great way, I think, to start thinking about these things. Because if you're just like, I want to, you never want to just animate something randomly. It's always in a context and a place with other elements. So I think looking at other apps is a great place. There is an open source library, bringing it back to Reactive. It's like an observable, I think it's like ScrollView observables. And it basically is, it's not like pure animations. It's more like it responds to touch events and kind of changes values based on that. But what's great about that project, and I think a bunch of other projects, open source projects have this, are sample apps. So you can play with all the animations, and you can play with all the kind of visual changes, and then you can look at the source code and see what's happening. So I happen to be a very visual learner, and so things like that work really well for me.
That is fantastic, and we'll try to add links to all of those in the show notes.
Yeah, and something else I actually just realized last week, which I had no idea before, in Android Studio, have you ever used the Android device monitor?
I probably don't know what you're mentioning, but yeah, go ahead.
So there's, in Android Studio, there are like a bunch of little Androids in the top bar, and if you just hover over them, next to the SDK manager is this Android device monitor. And if you plug it in while your phone is plugged in, or any device, you can basically capture a screenshot of whatever is on your phone, and then it actually shows you on the left, like, the view hierarchy. And so you can see, and it works on any, like, literally if you have Twitter open, you can see Twitter's view hierarchy. You can basically see the ID, like, of the object and a couple of the values, but it's really helpful if you're trying to, for example, understand how they're animating it or how they've, like, at least structured their XML file. it's kind of a cool way to sneak into some of these apps.
Very nice, very nice. I think there was a mechanism to do it before, like outside of Android Studio, but I believe this was added like pretty recently, right? Or maybe it was always there and I just didn't realize.
It might have been, and it's one of those things I literally discovered, I think, a month ago, and now I'm just like a stalker to all these other apps that I use. I'm like, how are they doing this?
Right. I remember in the early days, we wanted to look at how certain like photo applications like Instagram and stuff were building their views, just to see like in terms of like performance and optimization, and seeing their view hierarchies just gives a bunch of ideas, right?
Yep.
So you can like, so that's how they used maybe a relative layout and something else. So like maybe there's a way to achieve it. So it's sort of like this interesting game you can play with.
Absolutely. Sort of. And I think something with Android too, which is kind of, there are always, we talked last time about, are you a light, Android Studio person or a dark Android Studio? But I think they're also, are you a linear layout person or a relative layout person? Okay. Because I think depending on what you're trying to achieve, sometimes one is obviously better. But I think in a lot of cases, you could do it either way. So I'm always curious to see how other people, like what their preferred root layout is.
There was this conversation I was following on Twitter. Someone said there's no reason to use, obviously he was being a little like snarky and he's being funny. There's like any use case for a relative layout can sufficiently be solved using multiple combinations of linear layouts. So
that's my kind of guy.
Yeah. And then Romain Guy replied to this. He's like, yeah, you can do that, but I will find you. So there's definitely use cases to when you should be using nested layout. Well, actually, ideally, you don't want to be using nested layouts at all, but
right.
It's a fun exercise, at least for the sake of learning. Anything is okay. All right. So, Amanda, this was a whole lot of fun. Before we want to sort of wind this show down, it's time to give our listeners the awesome picks for the week. Do you want to start us off with your picks?
So something that I actually heard that Vice magazine does, which I think is a kind of a cool tip, is Slack is, I think, a really popular tool now for everyone, and I think that it's hard to keep up all the time, necessarily, with all the channels. And so something that they do, which we've tried to start implementing at Venmo, is having a to-read channel where people can go and post interesting articles and just kind of things that you would otherwise post in a totally normal, unrelated channel, but then there's no way of aggregating all of those, like, damn, where is that article that someone recommended I read? And so someone posted one in our to-read channel last week, and it was about being a senior engineer, which is a problem that I think a lot of us, either you think about it a lot or you never think about it, but kind of the weirdness of being an engineer and how the more senior you get, that actually means you are doing less engineering, and how kind of strange it is that that's the paradigm. And it talks a lot about what does it mean to be a mature engineer and in a field where like we all need to kind of learn from each other, and that's how everyone grows. How do you help yourself learn and also help your team learn if you're not necessarily programming all the time? And the differences between, like, I hate these terms, but hard skills and soft skills. Okay. But it's an interesting read, and I think any engineer at any stage in their career would really benefit from it.
Very interesting. So 2 tips actually there, right? Like, so one is like your Slack channel for to read, and the other is the link that we'll add into the show notes. Very cool. So my picks for the week is one I already mentioned about this example. I'll add it again towards the end of the show notes. It's amazing. They talk about how they built this custom interpolator. The other is, again, it's all animation related. So there's this app called Timely, which is known to have some of the most buttery, smooth, beautiful animations. It's essentially just like an alarm application. People love this application and they love the animations because they really took it to a new level. Subsequently, I guess they got acquired by Google.
Right.
There are like 2 people who have tried to sort of like emulate this specific kind of tweening animation in Timely. So for people who have used Timely, the app, you'll notice like the numbers, they sort of like have this tweening kind of like effect, right? So like they transform from one number to the other, like with a very beautiful animation. It makes more sense if you actually look at
right. Animations are best seen.
Yeah, exactly. I'll add a YouTube link as well to the animation that I'm trying to talk about. Alex Lockwood posted this link on YouTube. So I'll add a link to that. And Sriram Ramani from Facebook, he talks about how you would go about implementing this number tweening animation. So those are 2 links that I'll add as well. It takes a little different tack. It's like at the custom view level, but it's kind of interesting to follow on and try to understand how animations are implemented in general.
Very cool.
All right. So if people want to reach out to you, Amanda, what's the best way they can do that?
Twitter. My handle is MandyBess, MandyBess. B as in boy.
Perfect. So we will add a link to that as well. And people can find the show notes for this episode at fragmentedpodcast.com. If you have feedback and suggestions for us, as always, please feel free to tweet them at fragmentedcast, and Don or I will definitely have a look at them. If you want to get in touch with Don or me, Twitter is, again, a best place, and you folks know where to reach us. Thank you all for listening, and thank you so much for being here, Amanda. It is a pleasure. I enjoyed this episode a lot.
Thank you guys so much for having me again.
Such a pleasure.